Hi there and welcome to this video. As you'll have noticed, a couple of my videos over the summer have been really more sort of conversational, really discussing with you some of my thoughts around the wider camera market, that wider challenge of moving from DSLRs to mirrorless. And in this video I've been thinking about innovation. And I've been challenging myself with the release of the Sony A7R IV and the RX100 Mark VII in really thinking about the wider innovation space, not the technologies in the cameras, but the wider impact of the move to mirrorless and some of the players' strategies in the marketplace. I spend quite a bit of my time working with organisations around the innovation space, looking at new business models, different technologies, different approaches to innovation. So when I see one of the big players release new kit, it's always a good time for me to look at that and look at the wider context, because it's an overlap between my two worlds of innovation and imaging in the wider space. So with Sony's release, it got me thinking about how is the wider imaging space changing with the advent and the rise of mirrorless cameras. We all perhaps think of the likes of Nikon, Canon, Fuji, Sony, Panasonic as large corporate animals. However, when you look at their top level revenues at the total corporate level, there are two that stand out, and that's Sony and Panasonic, and they both have much larger businesses in the consumer electronics and imaging space, and they have revenues, annual revenues of between 8 and 9 trillion Japanese yen. And they truly dwarf all of the other players. The next one down is probably Canon, who have about 3 to 4 trillion Japanese yen in turnover from their wider business. And then you step down to Nikon with under 1 trillion Japanese yen per annum, so about 10% of the size of a Sony. You then step down to Fuji at about 2.6 billion Japanese yen, so a much smaller enterprise. Now that's obviously looking at their total corporate earnings. Their earnings from imaging is very different. Now the reason I look at that level is because that's the resources they have at their disposal to look at strategic areas, or to invest in strategic areas. And Sony have said that they have a strategic goal of moving into that mirrorless camera space. So when you marry up the resources at their disposal plus their strategic intent, it makes an interesting picture in that innovation space. So when one of the big players with resources and strategic intent starts to move in a marketplace, it's going to have ripples. And that's what we're seeing in the mirrorless space. When you marry that up with the fact that Sony perhaps also have a disproportionate impact in the sensor space through their sensor business, it's an interesting space, and one that's worth keeping an eye on, not for any negative reasons, but because it can have these ripple effects, as I say, into other manufacturers. So I thought I'd just take a quick look at the drumbeat releases from Sony and Nikon and see how they compare. If we look at the A7R range, then Sony released the first generation back in October 2013. They released the second generation in August 2015, the third generation in October 2017, and then the fourth generation was released in July this year. And between those there was a 1 year 10-month gap, a 2 year 2-month gap, and then a 1 year 9-month gap. So what we're seeing is a release every 2 years or less broadly. If we then compare it to the Nikon DSLR releases in the D800, D810, D850, the D800 was released in February 2012, the D810 in June 2014, and the D850 in July 2017. And that was a 2 year 4-month gap between the D800 and the D810, and then a 3 year 1-month gap between the D810 and the D850. The Z series is slightly different. That was a 1 year gap, but that was a change in format totally, so that's a bit different. So if we take that out of the equation, what we see is that Nikon had a drumbeat of probably 2 to 3 years between releases. So that's quite a difference between Sony's drive of 2 years or under between releases and Nikon's drive of 2 to 3 years between releases. And what we're probably seeing is, Sony has a business that is largely in the consumer electronics space, and we're in that space where we're used to Apple releasing an iPhone or Samsung releasing a Galaxy smartphone on an annual drumbeat. So what we're seeing is a bit of a tension perhaps between the traditional camera manufacturers like Nikon and Canon, who are up at the sort of 3-year drumbeat, and the consumer electronics style of an annual drumbeat, with Sony sitting somewhere in between of somewhere under 2 years between releases. And that got me thinking is around this, is too much innovation going to be a bit of a challenge for us in the camera market, because we're not used to changing our cameras, and we can't afford probably to change our cameras on an annual drumbeat. We're perhaps more comfortable with a 3-year sort of drumbeat. And how is that tension going to play out? Because Sony do have the resources and control of some of the key components that could drive a much more regular drumbeat of release. So there's a real potential tension between the sort of camera world and the consumer electronics world here. And that can be a positive and it can be a negative. Smartphones are relatively independent. You can upgrade a smartphone and you don't necessarily have to upgrade your PC or your laptop to go with it. Whereas with cameras, it's part of a wider ecosystem. That post-processing world is increasingly important, whether you're shooting still images or videos. As I found out in my recent Musings from Bologna video, my PC, which is a fairly powerful, fairly recent PC, was really struggling to process some of those larger panoramas, not necessarily as still images, but when I used them in videos, it was struggling to process them even at 1080p, let alone 4K. Eventually I tweaked the settings and reduced the quality down to a point where actually the computer could cope with it and could produce and render a 4K video with those large panoramas included. But it just shows the challenge of that larger ecosystem that we have to operate in, and changing your camera, perhaps increasing it to a 60 megapixel sensor, is going to have a massive impact on storage, processing, rendering, and therefore you've got to consider that wider ecosystem, as I've talked about in my video on 1080p versus 4K. So I think it's likely that the move to mirrorless will tighten that drumbeat of releases. Will it move towards the 1 year? Yes, probably, but will it get closer to that? I don't know. Sony will probably see at under 2 years. I think some of the other manufacturers will probably see moving towards the 2 years, but it will take them some time to get there because perhaps they don't have the resources available to them. And some of the market challenges, will consumers want to, or will professionals and consumers want to move to a sub 2 year drumbeat, or will we be happy at a 3-year drumbeat? If we look at some of the drivers behind the drumbeat, it comes down to largely around sensors, both in terms of the autofocus capabilities of them and the dynamic range of them. And it also comes down to processors, and will processors keep up with the need to process the data from larger sensors? So those are two of the drivers behind the technology, but it's not all about technology, as I've said. I think we're going to see the business model coming into play here, and as I've said, Sony have deep pockets. They have a strategic intent, and they have an element of control over the sensor business, because that's part of the wider Sony business. And what we're seeing there is something similar to what we're seeing with Apple, where Apple have a stated intent of having increased control over key components in their technology roadmap. And that's why we've seen Apple move to buy the Intel modem business and the intellectual property of that business. From my experience, innovation works best when there is a competitive landscape. And I don't think that's changed just yet. I think what we're seeing is some early, sort of tensions appearing between the different manufacturers, between consumer electronics and the photography world, the imaging world. And as I say, I don't think that's changed. Even with Sony having control over a large portion of the sensor manufacturing arena, that isn't necessarily changing the competitive landscape. There's enough opportunity for the big players to adapt those sensors, to change the approach they have to processors, to perhaps adjust the algorithms that they have. There's enough latitude there for a competitive landscape. But probably the biggest challenge coming up is not the technology, as I've said. It's around that business model, that tension between an annual drumbeat of consumer electronics releases versus a perhaps 3-year plus release that's been more traditional in the DSLR market. And that's one to keep an eye on. This video isn't intended to be a brand-specific viewpoint. As I've said in previous videos, I think that the mirrorless lineups from all the manufacturers have pros and cons, they have trade-offs. There is no one optimum solution, which is great because it demonstrates there is a bit of innovation going on in the marketplace. I do think that the move to mirrorless is a real step up and offers some real opportunities for content creators, both in terms of still images and video, and also that hybrid, that overlap that the mirrorless cameras are offering to content creators. So, you know, for me, long live innovation and the great images and videos it's helping content creators create. So let me know what you think about innovation and the move to mirrorless in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and you'll be notified of future videos. And I look forward to seeing you in a future video.